March 17th, 1966, Thursday evening. Frank Lucas got a phone call at 6 o'clock. Bumpy's voice on the other end. Calm, direct. Be at Rayo's at 8 tonight. Wear a suit. Frank said, "What's the occasion?" Bumpy said, "You'll see," then hung up. Frank stood in his apartment holding the phone, trying to figure out what this was about. Rayo's was an Italian restaurant in East Harlem, small place, maybe 10 tables. You couldn't just walk in. You needed a reservation weeks in advance, or you needed to be connected. Bumpy had a table there, always the same one, corner spot, where he could see both doors. Frank had been there with Bumpy a few times, quiet dinners, business meetings, nothing unusual, but something about tonight felt different. The way Bumpy's voice sounded, controlled, like he was setting something up. Frank put on his best suit, navy blue, white shirt, thin black tie, polished his shoes, left his gun at home. Bumpy had a rule: no weapons at Rayo's. The Italians who owned the place respected Bumpy, but they had limits. You brought a gun into their restaurant, you didn't come back. Frank took a cab to East Harlem, pulled up in front of Rayo's at 10 to 8. The street was quiet, a few cars parked, lights on inside the restaurant, warm, inviting. Frank walked in. The owner, Vincent, greeted him at the door. "Mr. Lucas, Mr. Johnson is already here. This way." Vincent led him through the narrow restaurant, past 4 tables with Italian families eating pasta and drinking wine, past the bar where 2 old men were arguing about the Yankees, to the back corner, Bumpy's table. And sitting across from Bumpy, sipping red wine, was the last person Frank expected to see, Raymond "Red" Dillard. Frank stopped walking. His hand instinctively went to his waistband where his gun usually was. Wasn't there. Red Dillard looked up, smiled. Not a friendly smile, a knowing smile, the kind that said, "Yeah, I'm surprised too." Bumpy gestured to the empty chair. "Sit down, Frank." Frank didn't move. Red Dillard wasn't just Bumpy's enemy. He was Bumpy's oldest enemy. They'd been at war for 30 years, since the 1930s when Dutch Schultz tried to take over Harlem, and Red had sided with the Italians while Bumpy fought them. Red had tried to kill Bumpy at least 3 times that Frank knew about. Once with a car bomb, once with poisoned whiskey, once with a sniper on a rooftop. All 3 times, Bumpy survived. And Bumpy had returned the favor. In 1952, Bumpy's crew had burned down Red's numbers operation on Lenox Avenue. In 1958, Bumpy had Red's lieutenant arrested by tipping off the police. In 1961, Bumpy had publicly embarrassed Red at a funeral by refusing to shake his hand in front of 200 people. These men hated each other. Everyone in Harlem knew it. And now they were sitting at the same table, drinking wine, like old friends. Frank looked at Bumpy. "Boss, what's going on?" Bumpy said, "Sit down. We're having dinner." Frank sat, slowly. His eyes never left Red. Red was older now, maybe 65. Gray hair, thick glasses, hands that shook slightly when he lifted his wine glass, but his eyes were still sharp, still calculating. He looked at Frank the way a butcher looks at meat. Bumpy said, "Frank, you know Red." Frank said, "I know of him." Red chuckled. "That's diplomatic." Bumpy poured Frank a glass of wine. "We're celebrating tonight." Frank said, "Celebrating what?" "The end of a war." Frank looked between the 2 men. "What war?" Bumpy and Red glanced at each other. Then Red said, "Ours." Bumpy nodded. "Red and I have been fighting for 30 years. As of tonight, we're done." Frank felt like the floor had disappeared beneath him. "You're what?" "We're done," Bumpy repeated. "No more fighting, no more territory disputes, no more trying to kill each other. We're too old for this." Red raised his glass, "To being too tired to hate." Bumpy clinked his glass against Red's, "To survival." They both drank. Frank just stared. This had to be a trap, some kind of setup. Red was going to pull a gun, or Bumpy was going to signal someone, or this whole thing was a test.
But nobody moved, nobody reached for anything. The waiter came over, took their orders. Bumpy ordered veal, Red ordered pasta, Frank ordered nothing. Couldn't think, couldn't process what was happening.
Red leaned back in his chair, looked at Frank. "You're wondering why we're doing this?" Frank didn't answer. Red continued, "I'll tell you why. Because 30 years is a long time to hate someone. And you know what I realized last month? I can't even remember why we started fighting." Bumpy said, "I remember. You sided with the Italians in 1934, tried to cut me out of the numbers game." Red waved his hand. "That was business. You would have done the same." Bumpy nodded. "I did do the same. 2 years later, burned down your operation." Red laughed. "You did. Cost me $50,000. Bumpy smiled. "You deserved it." Red shrugged. "Probably." They were talking like they were reminiscing about a baseball game. Not 3 decades of violence, not attempted murders, not burned buildings and ruined lives, just business. Frank finally found his voice. "So that's it? You just decide it's over and it's over?" Bumpy looked at him. "Yes, that's exactly how it works. But you've been trying to kill each other for 30 years. And now we're not," Bumpy said, "because we decided not to." Frank shook his head. "I don't understand." Red leaned forward. "Let me explain something to you, kid. Bumpy and I, we've been playing the same game for 3 decades. We've taken territory from each other, sabotaged each other's operations, turned each other's people, and you know what we've accomplished? Nothing. I'm still here, he's still here. We're both older, both tired, both running the same neighborhoods we ran 30 years ago. What was the point?" Bumpy said. "There wasn't one. That's what we realized. We've been fighting over the same streets, the same money, the same respect. And all we've done is make ourselves enemies when we could have been colleagues." Frank said, "But he tried to kill you multiple times." Bumpy nodded. "He did. And I tried to kill him. We both failed. Maybe that means something." Red said, "It means we're both too stubborn to die and too smart to keep wasting energy on a war that neither of us can win." The waiter brought their food, set the plates down carefully, left without a word. Bumpy cut into his veal, started eating. Red twirled pasta on his fork. Frank sat there, watching, trying to make sense of it. Bumpy said, "Frank, you're young. You think the world is about winning and losing, about defeating your enemies, about proving you're the strongest." Red said, "We thought that too, for 30 years. And you know what we learned? There's no such thing as winning. There's only surviving. And surviving means knowing when to stop fighting." Frank said, "So you just forgive each other? Everything that happened?" Bumpy shook his head. "No, we don't forgive. We just don't care anymore. There's a difference." Red nodded. "Forgiveness implies that what happened was wrong and needs to be absolved. We're not doing that. We're just acknowledging that continuing this war serves no purpose." Bumpy said, "Red and I are going to die soon. Maybe 5 years, maybe 10. When we die, someone else takes over, someone younger, and they'll start their own wars, their own feuds. The cycle continues unless we stop it." Frank said, "How do you stop it?" "By showing them that enemies don't have to stay enemies forever," Bumpy said. "That smart men know when to walk away." They ate in silence for a few minutes. Frank picked at the bread on the table. His mind was racing. This didn't make sense. Everything Bumpy had taught him was about loyalty, about standing your ground, about never backing down. And now Bumpy was sitting here with a man who'd tried to kill him, acting like they were old friends. Finally, Frank said, "What happens now?" "Now," Red said, "Bumpy and I run our operations without interference. He stays out of my territory, I stay out of his. We don't collaborate, we don't help each other, we just coexist." Bumpy said, "And if someone tries to start a war between us, we communicate. We don't let ourselves get played against each other." Red said, "Because the Italians would love nothing more than to watch us destroy each other. Then they could walk in and take everything.
We're not giving them that satisfaction. Bumpy looked at Frank. This is a lesson, Frank, the most important one I can teach you. Your enemies aren't always your enemies. Sometimes they're just people on the other side of the same struggle. And if you're smart, you figure out when fighting them costs more than ignoring them.
Red finished his pasta, wiped his mouth with a napkin, looked at Bumpy. This was good. We should do it again. Bumpy said, "Let's not get carried away." Red laughed. Fair enough. He stood up, extended his hand. Bumpy stood. They shook hands. Firm, brief. Then Red put on his coat, nodded at Frank. "Good luck, kid. You're gonna need it working for this one." He walked out. Frank watched him go, then looked at Bumpy. "I still don't understand." Bumpy sat back down, poured himself more wine. "You will. Give it 30 years. Frank said, "Why did you bring me here tonight?" Bumpy said, "Because one day you're going to have an enemy, someone you hate, someone who's tried to hurt you, and you're going to spend years fighting them, wasting time, wasting energy, wasting your life. And when you're 60 years old, sitting in a restaurant like this, you're going to realize that the fight was pointless. I wanted you to see what that looks like, so maybe you'll be smarter than I was. Maybe you'll figure it out sooner." Frank sat with that, turned it over in his mind, then said, "Do you trust him?" "Red? No." "Will you work with him?" "No." "Then what's the point?" "The point," Bumpy said, "is that he's not trying to kill me anymore, and I'm not trying to kill him. That's enough." Frank finished his wine. They sat in silence for a while. The restaurant was emptying out. The families had gone home. The old man at the bar had left. It was just Bumpy and Frank now. Finally, Bumpy said, "You know what the hardest part of tonight was?" "What?" "Admitting that I wasted 30 years, that I could have done this in 1936 and saved myself 3 decades of looking over my shoulder." Frank said, "Why didn't you?" "Pride. Same reason Red didn't. We both thought walking away meant losing. It took us 30 years to realize that sometimes walking away is the only way to win." They left the restaurant at 10:30, walked out into the cool March night. Bumpy's car was parked across the street. They got in. Bumpy drove, didn't say anything for a while, just drove through the streets of Harlem, past the Apollo, past the clubs, past the corners where young men stood selling whatever they could sell. After a while, Bumpy said, "Frank, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "When you're running things, when I'm gone, I need you to remember tonight. Remember that making peace with your enemies isn't weakness, it's wisdom." Frank said, "I'll remember." Bumpy said, "Good, because the men who survive in this business aren't the toughest. They're the ones who know when to fight and when to stop. Red and I figured that out. Took us 30 years, but we figured it out. Don't take that long." Frank thought about that night for years. In 1968, when Bumpy died, Frank took over, built his empire, made millions. And he made enemies. Nicky Barnes, the Italians, corrupt cops, rival dealers. And for a while, Frank fought all of them. Spent energy, spent money, spent years looking over his shoulder. Then, in 1973, Frank ran into Nicky Barnes at a club. They'd been feuding for 2 years. Territory disputes, money disputes, respect disputes. Nicky walked up to Frank's table. Frank's hand went to his waistband. Nicky said, "We need to talk." Frank said, "Talk." Nicky said, "This is stupid. We're both making money. We're both successful. Why are we fighting?" Frank thought about Bumpy and Red, about that night at Rayo's. He said, "You're right. It is stupid." They made a deal that night, split the territory, stayed out of each other's way. It lasted 2 years, until Nicky got arrested and turned informant. But for those 2 years, Frank didn't have to watch his back, didn't have to waste resources on a war. He thought about Bumpy, about the lesson, about how the smartest move isn't always the aggressive one.
In 1975, when Frank was arrested, he had time to think, a lot of time. He thought about all the enemies he'd made, all the wars he'd fought, and he realized that most of them had been pointless, just like Bumpy and Red's war had been pointless. 30 years of violence that accomplished nothing. Frank had been smarter. He'd only fought for 5 years before he got caught. But the principle was the same. Energy wasted, life wasted, all because pride wouldn't let him walk away. In 2007, a reporter asked Frank about his biggest regret. Frank thought about it, then said, "I regret not learning Bumpy's lessons faster. He tried to teach me that enemies are just people, that fighting them isn't always necessary, that sometimes the smartest thing you can do is stop." The reporter said, "When did he teach you that?" Frank said, "March 17, 1966. He took me to dinner with his worst enemy, and I watched two men who'd tried to kill each other for 30 years sit down and eat pasta like nothing had happened. I didn't understand it then, thought it was weakness, but it wasn't. It was the opposite. It was strength. The kind of strength that comes from knowing when you've had enough." The reporter asked, "Did you ever do that, make peace with an enemy?" Frank said, "Once, with Nicky Barnes. Lasted 2 years. Then he betrayed me anyway. But for those 2 years, I understood what Bumpy was trying to teach me, that peace isn't about trust, it's about calculation. It's about realizing that fighting costs more than coexisting. Bumpy and Red didn't trust each other. They just stopped wasting energy on each other. That's all peace ever is." The reporter said, "Do you think Bumpy regretted waiting 30 years? Frank said, "I know he did. He told me. That night in the car, he said making peace with Red was the smartest thing he'd ever done, and the fact that it took him 30 years to do it was the dumbest. He didn't want me to make the same mistake, but I did anyway, because I was young, and young men don't listen." What Frank never told anyone was what happened 3 days after that dinner. He was in Bumpy's office. They were going over numbers, territory, money, and Frank asked, "Boss, do you really think Red is done fighting?" Bumpy looked up, said, "No." Frank said, "Then why did we have that dinner?" Bumpy said, "Because now he knows I'm done, and that changes everything." Frank didn't understand. Bumpy explained, "When both men want to fight, you have war. When one man wants to fight and the other doesn't, you have harassment. But the harassment eventually stops because there's no point. Red might test me, might push boundaries, but he's not going to start a full war because he knows I won't engage, and a one-sided war is just suicide." Frank said, "What if he tries to kill you again?" "Then I'll deal with it," Bumpy said, "but I'm not going to preemptively attack him just because he might attack me. That's how wars last 30 years. Someone has to stop first. Might as well be me." Frank said, "That sounds like weakness." Bumpy smiled. "It sounds like weakness to young men. To old men, it sounds like survival." Red Dillard died in 1969. Heart attack, natural causes. When Bumpy heard, he went to the funeral, stood in the back, didn't speak, didn't approach the family, just stood there for 20 minutes, then left. Frank asked him later why he went. Bumpy said, "Because he was my enemy for 30 years, and for the last 3 years, he wasn't. That deserves acknowledgement." Frank said, "Did you respect him?" Bumpy thought about it, then said, "No, but I respected what we figured out together, that hate is exhausting and life is too short to carry it forever." Red Lucas lived to be 88 years old, died in 2019, and in all those years, he never forgot March 17, 1966, the night Bumpy Johnson sat down with his worst enemy and showed Frank that the real power isn't in defeating people, it's in outlasting them, and sometimes outlasting them means making peace.